Okay, well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's launch webinar for Fathom's new global flood data, Fathom-Global 3.0. My name is Stuart Whitfield, and I'm Chief Executive of Fathom. I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar, in which my colleagues will present the combination of many years' scientific research, technical development work, and not least, the input from our customers and partners across the insurance, capital markets, engineering, and international development communities. Fathom-Global 3.0. Fathom was established to provide comprehensive water risk intelligence for the entire planet, and our latest release, Fathom-Global 3.0, marks a significant step in that mission. Over the next 45 minutes or so, we will hear from Fathom's co-founder, Dr. Andy Smith, on why our new flood hazard data and climate dynamics framework represent a major step forward in understanding flood risk. Andy will give a technical overview of the new global flood map and why we think it represents the state of the art in global flood risk modelling. My colleague, Dr. Natalie Lord, will then explain Fathom's climate dynamics framework and how our flood models incorporate climate data to produce flood hazard data for any climate scenario for any future year this century, anywhere on Earth. And finally, my colleague, Dr. Matt Jones, will talk about some of the use cases of our global flood map and how the data may be accessed, including through our new Fathom API. There'll obviously then be time at the end of the session for a Q&A, so please submit your questions via the question chat at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom webinar. I really hope you find the presentations valuable today, and so without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Andy Smith. Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Stuart, and hi everyone, wherever you are in the world. Thanks for joining us today. So it's over to me to run through, I guess, the technical details around the new global model and all of the things that we've been working on over the past few years. Before I do that, I will just quickly introduce Fathom itself. As Stuart said, we were formed to try and build risk models, actually of the whole planet. We were formed out of the University of Bristol in the UK by one of the world leading research groups in the field of building these things called computational flood models. And as we said, we had the aim in the beginning of trying to build models actually in the most data poor areas in the world. And we've been attempting to do that now for the last 8 years. And this is the third iteration of our global model. And a really important point to make here is that I'm going to give you a very quick overview this morning of some of the technical updates. But actually, there's a very rich literature of all of our techniques and models, actually going all the way back to the first two-dimensional flood models back in the early 1990s. And one of the nice things for us as an organization is that lots of the seminal papers in our field over the past 5 to 6 years in particular have actually come from Fathom, and you can really dig into the methods that I'll quickly outline in a moment as much as you'd like. For a little bit of context, and hopefully this is not really needed, but to kind of outline why we need these models. Well, flooding is the most costly natural disaster in the world. You can pluck any large number from numerous reports to highlight this point, and it will get worse. Even if the climate was stationary, we can expect flood risk in the future to amplify significantly just because of urbanization patterns. That's what the research tells us. But of course, we are living in non-stationary times as well. We are living in a climate that is non-stationary, and there are seemingly many examples now of unprecedented events occurring. And I've just highlighted one event here, which is a rain gauge in Central Park in New York that had its record broken twice within the space of 8 weeks last year. And that record actually went all the way back to 1886. And lastly, on why these models are important. Well, this is a piece of research that we co-authored that was published just last week. And I think it really nicely outlines the scale of the problem. What you see here is urbanization in flood zones. So you're looking at the percentage of urban areas that are being built in flooded areas. And what we see is that this is growing in time, but it's actually also accelerating as well. We seem to be building more and more and more in risky areas. And another paper this year, published by Oliver Wing, also showed that the majority of future risk is actually historical risk. So we can avoid hazardous areas. And I think that's a really important point to make here. It's actually a note of optimism, I'd say. Hopefully, at the end of this presentation, you'll have an indication that we can build models now that are skillful anywhere in the world. So we have the information to avoid exactly these kinds of developments and planning decisions. So onto the models themselves. This on your screen at the moment is designed to give you an indication of the kinds of models that we build here at Fathom, but also the kinds of models that really you can build when you have lots and lots of information. This is a dynamic simulation of a city in the north of England, and it's a simulation of an actual event. And the simulation is actually within error of observations. Now, when you observe a flood event, there's actually uncertainty in the observations themselves. And these models, when you have lots of information, are actually within error of those observations. So they're effectively as good as we can measure them to be. And that's really, really great. But before we pat ourselves on the back, this is actually the state of the science 15 years ago. We could build exactly these kinds of models. The real challenge and the real problem comes when you try to move from these local scale simulations where you have lots of information, where you can go out and do things like survey river channels, where you have observations of river flows. When you remove all of those things, and you even actually remove good terrain data sets, then building flood models becomes very, very difficult. You also have the huge problem of scale. Flooding is a spatially complex peril. It varies highly in space. You can be wet in one point and dry a few meters away. To represent that complexity in a dynamic model that simulates somewhat complex physics is computationally very difficult to do. So this is a little list of problems that we actually wrote down on a whiteboard at the University of Bristol when I was undertaking my PhD. And this was our list of things that we thought you had to solve in order to be able to build flood models anywhere in the world. And they are terrain data sets. Back then, we were limited to information from the Shuttle Radar Topography mission, which was riddled with errors. Channels, you have to represent river channels. You can't simply ignore them in flood models. They are the thing that convey water to and from floodplains. So we need to know where they are and also how big they are. But there are no observational records of river channels around the world. There's not observations of things like rainfall and river flow or coastal information for the whole planet. That just doesn't exist. We actually don't even have comprehensive gauge data, even in somewhere developed and small like the UK. So we have to find ways to estimate boundary conditions. You need to estimate defenses as well. Again, we don't have observations of defenses. And lastly, automation and efficiency. You have to build these models in an automated way if you want to make them truly global, and they have to be incredibly efficient. Now, very excitingly, I would say, in the last 3 years, we've been working on various components of these models. And these are the things that I'm going to talk through quickly today. We have, perhaps the most important thing is that we have a brand new terrain data set. The European Space Agency last year released a new terrain data set that I'll go into in some detail in a moment, but it's a significant advancement on what went before it. At Fathom, we've also introduced a new peril. So we have both flash flooding, riverine flooding, and now coastal information. And one of the biggest things we've ever developed here is our climate dynamics framework that we're going to introduce briefly today. And my colleague Natalie is going to talk through that, but there will be a separate webinar to go into the details of that. We also have some really neat new methods for representing river channels, the size of them and where they are, and also how we actually estimate boundary conditions. And I'll talk through some of the validation work and leave it to Matt to talk through some of the new offerings in terms of risk scores and risk categorization. So quickly on terrain data sets. Now, when we're building flood models of the whole planet, we're limited, where we don't have local terrain data sets, we're limited to data sets collected from space. And these are typically radar products. Now, radar products are not terrain models, they are surface models. So the radar beam bounces off trees and it bounces off buildings. And we have to remove those artifacts in our models if we want to build flood models. There's also historically been huge problems with things like instrumentation error as well, and things like speckle and noise. And what you can see on your screen at the moment is an indication of where we were during our last global model, and that's on the left. In the worst case scenario, we were building models using merit DEM. And as you can see, compared to the DEM on the right, which is what I would call truth, there's a lot of noise and speckle and artifacts that are effectively causing the terrain data set to be erroneous. But our team has been, I would say, heavily involved, if not leading the development of cleaning these kinds of data sets over the past 2 decades, in fact, all the way back to when we were building models with raw data from the shuttle missions. But very excitingly, the European Space Agency last year released Copernicus DEM. Now, this is a new radar-based terrain data set that still had buildings and vegetation in it. But we have taken that data set and applied all of our learnings over the past 2 decades and released a new terrain data set called FABDEM. That's Forest and Buildings Removed DEM. We've applied a whole suite of machine learning methods to clean up the data set. And this now underpins all of our global models in the worst case scenario. And the paper defining all of the methods was published in ERL last year. So I would urge you to check that out if you're interested. But as I've mentioned, it's the worst case scenario now that our models will be underpinned by a radar product. Actually, the blue here indicates where we have better terrain data sets. So these are principally LiDAR-based data sets that we have a team of people here at Fathom collating and collecting LiDAR that we can use in our models. I should also add that the terrain data sets, if any modelers are listening in, you can also license the terrain data set separately from us as well. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning, river channels are incredibly important in flood models. You have to represent the processes of both where they are and how big they are and how they convey water to and from floodplains. But there are no national data sets on channel bathymetries, so we don't know how big they are. In fact, a few years ago, we didn't even robustly know where they all were in the world, never mind how big they are. Now, this represents a huge problem for us, but we had something of a brainwave back when we were building the early versions of our global models. And that is that we can link the size of the channels to estimates of bankful discharge. And what I mean by that is that we can observe how often rivers fill up, and we can assign a frequency to that. So we can say, this river channel fills up once every 2 years, for example. We can then take our 1 in 2 year flow that we estimate from our discharge model, and we could rearrange the Manning's equation using estimates of things like upstream slope to define a wetted perimeter. So you're linking the size of the river channel to estimates of discharge. And that's actually really neat because it actually accounts for biases in 2 things. It accounts for biases in our estimates of channel size, but also biases in our estimates of river discharge, which will for sure be erroneous and biased at global scales. However, one of the things that we realized in the last few years is that our assumptions weren't being implemented correctly. And that's because when you simply rearrange the Manning's equation, you don't account for things like backwatering effects. So at things like confluences where 2 rivers join, what we're seeing is that even if we were defining channel conveyance to be a 1 in 2 year flow, then water was still leaving the river channels. Now, this has led to a really neat piece of modeling that's been led by the University of Bristol, and that's the dynamic channel solver. We now have a pre-simulation that we run before we actually run the dynamics. And the pre-simulation simulates how big the river channels need to be to convey a certain volume of water. We use the Manning's estimate as a first step, and then it iteratively solves how big the channels need to be to convey our assumed volume of water. Onto the actual volumes of water themselves. Now, when you're trying to build riverine models for the whole planet, we need ways of estimating extreme flows in every river on Earth. And as I mentioned at the beginning, there are no comprehensive observational data sets. We wrote a paper back in 2015 that defined a regional flood frequency analysis at the global scale. Now, a regional flood frequency analysis simply links catchment characteristics to extreme flow behaviors, with the assumption being that you can take those relationships and apply them elsewhere in the world. For example, if you have a small wet catchment in Florida, you can take that information and apply it to a small wet catchment with similar characteristics in Vietnam. What we've been working on for the past few years, however, is a new method. And the new method is actually a machine learning method that links predictive variables to target variables. A regional flood frequency analysis actually lends itself very, very well to machine learning because you do have effectively predictive variables and target variables. And the paper published last year by Zhao et al., again, was led at the University of Bristol. And we've taken this and applied it at global scales, and it's led to some really significant improvements in our estimates of discharge across the whole planet. Hopefully the table in the middle makes some sense, but that gives you some root means, absolute root mean squared errors against observations for a 100-year event across all of our gauges. And what we see is that there have been some significant error reductions compared to our previous model. Indeed, I would argue now that we're getting almost as good as we can get in many instances, particularly given some of the uncertainties in observing extreme flow itself. This model is now applied to derive extreme flows anywhere on Earth. And again, any modelers out there, engineers, we can actually provide access to these data if useful. Now, pluvial modeling represents a really huge challenge in the realm of hydraulic modeling because of the scale. We're talking about highly localized events impacting very, very small river channels. And the way in which we actually simulate these phenomena in our models is to use the same model structure that's run in the riverine models. All of the river networks exist still in the model, but we're effectively raining into the domain. So we're raining onto the grid, and then we're simulating the conveyance of flow through all the river channels. The big update that's happened in the past few years is, again, a machine learning based one. And again, we've built a new model that simulates extreme rainfall magnitudes for the whole planet. And this links predictive variables, principally ERA5 data, and 18 other climate variables to a global gauge network. And we've used this to define intensity, duration, frequency relationships for the whole planet. Our models simulate the 1, 3, and 6 hour events, and then we take the maximum extent from those as our pluvial simulation for a given return period. One of the neat things I think we've done as well is to try and better define a differentiation between a pluvial event and a fluvial event. It's important when you're thinking about risk modeling that you're not double counting, that you're not simulating a phenomenon twice on the same river reach. And the way we do this now at Fathom is that we simulate up to a 6 hour event with our pluvial model, and then we actually compute a time to concentration that's greater than 6 hours, and it's only at that point that we actually implement fluvial boundary conditions. So there's a nice differentiation now, or a clear boundary between what is a fluvial event and what is a pluvial event. Now on to the thing that we've actually never done before, and that is coastal modeling. One of the exciting things that's happened here in the last 18 months is that we've hired a fantastic team of coastal modelers led by Ivan Haig at the University of Southampton. And we've built global coastal, both boundary conditions and of course, hazard information. Now, our global coastal model is actually a blend of global models and local coastal gauges. And again, it's undertaken in a regionalized way. So we regionalize the model to link global models with coastal gauges. And this is all fed into our 2D hydraulic modeling framework. And here's a little image that tries to illustrate what some of the data look like for all of Africa, actually. So this is a zoom in of some areas in Africa. Our defenses in flood models are, of course, very important to represent. You're going to overestimate exposure in urban areas if you don't represent them. But again, we don't have comprehensive observational data sets. They don't even exist actually in places like the US. We estimate that the observed defense data sets are only about 30% complete. So we've undertaken a whole bunch of work in this space in the past few years. We've published papers that define how to detect defenses from high resolution LiDAR. And we've also published papers defining how we can represent defenses both within the channels and using estimates linking urbanization to some form of estimated defense magnitude. And in our global model now, defenses are represented in a combination of ways. So we represent them explicitly where they're known or where we can detect them from defenses. And where they're not known, we actually simulate them. So we estimate areas that would be defended and link that to defense estimates from the FlowPros data set. And we also use our sampling framework now to simulate overtopping in those areas as well. A few quick notes on some of the nitty-gritty modeling points. It's incredibly important when you're simulating these models at scale that you have really efficient models. And I think Fathom have been pioneering in developing some of the efficient hydrodynamic models that now exist in the world. And we've hired software engineers in the past few years who've obtained even greater speed ups in our hydraulic models compared to our previous versions. And this is all undertaken in our automated modeling frameworks. Anybody really interested in how we build hydraulic models at global scales, I would urge you actually to read the 2015 paper led by Chris Sampson. And that outlines nicely what these kinds of frameworks look like in practice. Our new framework has been updated significantly, runs now in a different language, and is much quicker than it was before. I've got a few examples now of what the evolution of these data look like. So this is Zimbabwe. And this is version 1 of our data back to 2015, onto our model run over merit DEM. And now you'll see what the data look like today. And you can see some of the smaller channels are far better defined now, but we're actually even able to simulate the smallest flow pathways. This is Germany, and this is unfortunately the town that was impacted very badly last year in the floods in July. And this represents actually one of the worst places we can try and model in global models, because it's a steep-sided valley, and the original terrain data sets really struggled. Now, the red you see here is a footprint from the event itself, an estimated event footprint from Copernicus. And the blue here is a 1 in 200-year event from Global 1, our first model. And you can just see that the terrain data just really struggled here. They couldn't pick up the valley bottom. There were some really big improvements with merit DEM, where we're able to pick up even the bottom of steep-sided valleys. But now on to the new version of our model, we really are able to pick up even these really difficult areas with purely global data sets, which is what we have here. A note on validation, I would say that Fathom's models are the most validated flood models perhaps in the world. We have a list of publications defining the validation of our frameworks over the past few years, so you can dig into those. I've got some validation updates here on the new global model, but more will follow. So this is some of this can't be shared right now because it'll be submitted soon for publication. But what we're seeing is a significant improvement in the models compared to our previous model. Increases in hit rates, so where the model should be wet, those hit rates are improving, and an even bigger decrease in general in false alarm ratios. And I think this is principally down to terrain data sets. But there's an example here from Vietnam, and we have a comparison of satellite observations versus our global model. And what you can see here is that when we take the nearest event footprint or the nearest hazard layer to what we perceive or estimate to be the event frequency, we actually saw an 84% match between the two data sets, which is, given the uncertainties in the satellite observations, I would argue is almost as good as you can get. This is the last slide for me, and I'll hand over to Natalie. But our dynamics framework is for sure, I think, one of the most exciting things that we developed here. So with that, thank you for listening, and I'll hand over to Natalie.
Thanks, Andy. So yes, I'm now going to talk about our climate dynamics framework, which enables us to account for the impacts of climate change in our flood modelling. And this allows us to produce climate conditioned hazard data for fluvial, pluvial and coastal modelling for any future emission scenario anywhere in the world, providing a really powerful tool for understanding changing global flood risk. We'll be discussing our climate dynamics framework in more detail during a webinar on the 16th of November, so please do sign up for that. I believe the link to register for this will be posted in the chat box any minute. Next slide, please. So we use data from state-of-the-art global climate models to try to understand how things like extreme precipitation and peak flow may change in the future under different levels of global warming. Then, rather than using the outputs of the climate models to directly force our flood models, we adopt a change factor approach, also referred to as delta change. And this involves using the relative changes from the climate models to update our historical baseline data and allows us to link the output from global climate models to our high-resolution flood maps. We also use an ensemble of climate and global hydrological models rather than a single model, which allows us to estimate the uncertainty and confidence associated with the future projections. And this is because different models have been built by different institutions around the world at different times, may contain different components of the climate and Earth system. They may be parameterized in different ways, so they may physically represent some climate processes and then parameterize other climate processes. And this means that they all have slightly different strengths and weaknesses and sensitivities, and may also give slightly different answers even when run when using the same forcing conditions. So with extreme precipitation, for example, even the sign of change can be different in some regions across different models. So by using an ensemble, some of this model uncertainty can be characterized, and if multiple models agree on the same signal of change, then that increases our confidence that the climate signal may be physically realistic. Using an ensemble also allows us to provide a range of projections for each climate query rather than a single view of flood hazard. And we believe this is much more realistic given the uncertainties associated with future climate and flood modelling. For this, we focus on the central 66% range of the distribution of projections corresponding with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Changes, or IPCC's definition of likely. And for our pluvial change factors, we use climate data from the CMIP6 high-res MIP ensemble. For our fluvial change factors, we use an ensemble of global climate and hydrological models from the CMIP5 ISI-MIP2B project. And then we use sea level rise projections from the IPCC's latest 6th assessment report. Next slide, please. So our climate dynamics framework has deliberately been developed to be scenario agnostic. And this means that users will be able to access climate condition flood maps for any sensible combination of future year and climate scenario. A query may be 2070 under the emissions scenario SSP 5 8.5, for example. Next slide, please. Another option is for users to select a future year and global warming level of interest. So, for example, a 2-degree warming in 2050. And this gives real flexibility in the future flood data that we can provide, whether that's for existing emission scenarios, such as the IPCC's SSP pathways, or new regulatory scenarios that may be developed in the coming years. So if you know which scenarios you're interested in exploring, then great. But equally, if you'd like to have a chat with us about which scenarios may be most relevant to your use case, then we're very happy to do that. Next slide, please. So to summarize, with Fathom Climate Dynamics, we can provide inland and coastal flood conditioned, climate conditioned flood hazard maps for a flexible range of future time periods, warming levels, and emission scenarios. And we believe this will be a really useful tool to help users to understand flood-related climate change impacts globally. I'll now hand over to my colleague, Dr. Matt Jones, to explain exactly what is available and how it can be accessed.
Thanks very much for that, Nat. Hi, everyone. So you've heard from Andy and Nat about the great science and the huge amount of work that's gone into our global flood map product. And I'd like to now talk about what you'll actually get if you license our data. So which metrics you'll get, what dimensions are available. And I'll go into a bit more detail on some of the climate options that are available. The features in the product, if you like. And I'll also talk about some of the ways in which these data can be used in the sectors that are already using these kinds of data, how to access our data, and when everything that you've heard about already will be available. Next slide, please. So to start with, what are the data? What will you be licensing if you access our data? And I think the first thing that's important to say is that the resolution of the data is at around about 30 meters. In fact, it's at worst 30 meters. It's actually 1 arcsecond resolution data globally. And when I say global, I do mean global. Unless you're in Antarctica or Greenland, we can give you information about your flood risk everywhere on the planet. And there's 2 main categories of metrics that you can access by licensing our data. One are flood depths. You might traditionally call those flood hazard maps. So this is depths for different frequencies of flooding. And the other category of metrics that I'll talk about in a minute are risk scores, and that's new to our global flood map. So hazard maps or flood depths by return period are what are traditionally presented in a flood product like this. And you can get those for different types of peril and in defended and undefended forms. So fluvial is river flooding, defended or undefended options available there. Pluvial is surface water or flash flooding, and coastal flooding is the impact of storm surge and tides and waves and the flooding that can cause, again, available in both defended and undefended format. And the sort of use case, the usage for these type of data, or if you need to understand your flood risk at a particular frequency of flooding. So for example, if you're looking to buy insurance or need to think about insurance, you might only be able to get insurance in a particular floodplain, say a 100-year floodplain. And therefore it's useful to know whether you're in that 100-year floodplain or not. In some territories, you may actually not be able to buy insurance if you're in certain flood zones. Another use case for this type of data is if you're looking to build a property, design a building, and that building needs to be resilient to a certain frequency of flooding, let's say the 1,000-year flood, then it's useful to know how bad the 1,000-year flood can be, how deep the water could be in a 1,000-year flood. So that's flood depths. We've had that in previous iterations of this product, and indeed you can get flood depths for a range of return periods from 5 years to 1,000 years in this Fathom-Global 3 product. Something new to the product, something we're adding with this release, is the concept of risk scores. and we've got a couple of different flavors of risk scores, which I'll go through. So risk scores essentially help you understand whether you're at risk at a certain point and how that risk compares to other points around the globe. So it's looking across the different frequencies, across the different return periods, if you like. And I'll start off with our relative risk metric. And a way of thinking about that is if you take an arbitrary exposure, a uniform exposure, so for example, a certain type of house of a certain arbitrary value, let's say 1 million, and you work out the average annual loss, so the mean annual loss for that property in a grid cell, and then you move that around every grid cell on the planet and you work out what the average annual loss would be to that property everywhere on the planet, then that's what we mean by relative risk. So we're not changing exposure, we're not changing the type of property. The information you're getting from that sort of analysis is how does my risk at this location compare to my risk in another location? But it's looking at a lot of information to do that. It's looking at across the whole spectrum of flood frequencies. Risk category is a similar sort of metric. The relative risk gives you a score essentially between 0 and, in theory, 1 million. If you don't want to have such a broad range of information, then we categorize that into a smaller set of values using the risk category, risk score. So what we do, we categorize relative risk into a score between 6 and 100, and it's just purely a chunking up, if you like, of the relative risk score. And then what we also do, we look outside the extreme flood. So we look outside the 1,000-year flood, and we look at locations that are proximate to that extreme flood. And we categorize locations near the extreme flood, both in a vertical and horizontal sense, into scores 1 to 5. So risk category gives you two sort of facets of flood risk. Risks from locations that are proximate to the extreme flood and risk within the flood zones itself. And the reason we do that is that flood modeling, like any sort of modeling, has uncertainty associated with it. And so even though we're very confident in this new set of flood maps, there's always a risk that locations close to the extreme flood are at risk of flood, and we want to give the users of our data a way of seeing where those locations are. So risk scores, relative risk and risk category new to the product. And you can get those in different types: fluvial, pluvial, coastal, inland, so the combination of fluvial and pluvial flooding, and flood, so the combination of fluvial, pluvial and coastal flooding. And what you don't see in that list there under risk scores is defended versus undefended options. And that's because when we're calculating relative risk, we estimate the probability of defense failure, and we use that to weight the defended and the undefended views of risk. So you have got an awful lot of information going into these risk scores across the whole frequency spectrum and bringing in information about defenses and indeed vulnerability. And so the sort of use case for risk scores are essentially understanding the risk at any location, not having to think about what frequency you're looking at, but wanting to understand the risk at one location versus another location now or in the future. Next slide, please. So those are the data, the metrics and the dimensions you get as standard. One of the really powerful things we think about this release is our climate dynamics framework, which allows users of this data a really flexible and broad range of climate options. And before getting into those future climate options, I think what's really important to note is that our default current set of maps, our baseline set of maps, if you like, represent a 2020 view of climate forcing. So of course, all the observational data that Andy was speaking about is scattered through history. And what we don't do is just use that observational data naively and assume we can just use that without any adjustment for climate trends. As Andy mentioned in his talk earlier, we're in a non-stationary environment. It would be wrong for us to do that. So a lot of thought and work has gone into making sure what we put forward as our current state of the climate represents a 2020, a consistent state of forcing. It's not just based on varied observational periods. So then looking forwards into estimating future risk, you can see the options listed in the table there. We have a range of years. You can actually go backwards, back to 2011 climate forcing, but looking forwards, you can go to the end of the century, pick any year you want to the end of the century, and you can combine that year with either a delta T, so a change in temperature. And by change in temperature, I mean a change in temperature compared to pre-industrial times. And by pre-industrial, I mean 1850 to 1900. So you can put in a change in temperature relative to pre-industrial combined with a year, Or if you have a particular scenario in mind, a particular pathway scenario, be that the SSP scenarios in the IPCC 6th assessment report, or the RCPs, which are prevalent in the 5th assessment report, or indeed the network for greening the financial system scenarios, 6 of those on offer as well. You can combine those scenarios with a year and get an estimate of how your flood risk will change for any of those combinations. Now, there's a lot of uncertainty in climate modelling. I think anyone that's done any climate modelling or looks at the results of climate model ensembles will realise that. And it would be remiss of us not to try and quantify and present to you that uncertainty. So as well as providing the median view of flood depth at different return periods, we also provide uncertainty layers as well. So we provide, by default, by standard, the 17th and the 83rd percentile, as well as a 50th, as well as a median. And those percentiles might seem slightly strange, but the reason for choosing the 17th and the 83rd is so that there's a 66% range in between those 2 percentiles, which coincides with the IPCC definition of likely. So there's a reason for picking the 17th and the 83rd percentiles. But the point is, this enables you to see where climate models agree and where they don't agree, and actually how much climate uncertainty there is in the projections of flood risk that we're making. And we think that is absolutely crucial. Next slide, please. So who are using these data? Who will use these data? And essentially, the use case for these data is very simple. If you want to understand your flood risk, whether you're inland or on the coast, whether you're only interested in your flood risk right now, or you're interested in your flood risk at some point in the future, wherever you are in the world, if you're interested in flood risk, these data are useful. So that's sort of a very simple expression of the use case. And as you can see from the slide, which represents current customers of our products, there's a whole range of different sectors represented there. And I haven't got time to talk through the use cases in all of these, but I'll touch on some of them. So starting with insurance, and insurance is the sector that I spent most of my career in. And the main use case in insurance is for primary insurance underwriting and pricing. So underwriting, the process of deciding whether or not to accept a risk and put your insurance company at risk. These data can be used for deciding whether or not to accept a risk, whether or not to apply terms on a risk, increase or reducing deductibles or limits, or indeed for pricing purposes, defining consistent rating areas using these data to work out what price you charge for the flood component of the insurance policy. And certainly, although these data are aimed mainly at the primary insurance sector, I think there are reinsurance use cases as well. Obviously, cat models is the area where reinsurers really focus. But in terms of portfolio differentiation, especially now we have risk scores, it's perfectly possible to run cedant portfolios, run the risk scores that I've just talked about across cedant portfolios, and use them to differentiate portfolios to portfolio score, if you like, in addition to the sort of metrics you get from cat models. So that's insurance. In terms of capital markets and ESG, I should say this column also includes banking and advisory services. And you can see a broad range of logos in this column, and certainly a broad range of use cases as well. And whether you're looking to put in place a climate analytics platform and you want to help people understand physical climate risk, help your clients understand physical climate risk, or whether you're looking to support a regulatory framework or a stress test, or whether actually you're a risk manager in a corporate looking to understand your own corporation's flood risk. There are a lot of use cases in this particular sector. Engineering, again, a number of uses for our data. An obvious use if you're an engineering consultancy is site screening. So you might have a project to assess flood risk on a number of sites around the world for a client. Not all of those sites would be at significant flood risk. So a really cost-effective way of ensuring you focus the local engineering specific design studies where they're most needed is to use our data to screen those sites and work at actually where do you need to focus the resource. Another use case in the engineering sector is if you're an engineering consultancy and you've been employed to do national or subnational risk assessment. And of course, the global scope of our data means our data are really well sorted to doing those sort of assessments. And then the final column here, international development. So these are people that help other people understand the really devastating and lethal nature of flood risk. And it's fantastic that our data can be used to help people, to warn people about the risk and to help people adapt to that risk. Now, the logos on this slide aren't all the customers we have. Some of our customers don't want their logo portrayed in this semi-public forum, but I can say that we actually have one of the largest investment managers in the world and one of the largest management consultancies in the world already licensed our Fathom-Global 3 data, including the climate dynamics framework. So they see the huge value that we think this has to offer people, and I hope you'll be able to see that too. Next slide, please. So how do you get access to the data? And there are three main ways of getting access to the data. The first is that you can host it yourself on premise. We can provide you a set of GeoTIFF files. And this is useful where you might have systems that you want to use the GeoTIFF files within. For whatever reason, you don't want to integrate via API, and you just want to hold the data yourself on premise. And of course, that's perfectly acceptable. We do that all the time. A few points with that method of accessing our data. One is that although this is very flexible framework for really defining a multitude of climate options, if you want to host the data yourself, you'll need to tell us what climate options you want. So those options will need to be predefined. And associated with a large number of potential climate options, the data volumes get quite large. So for one discrete set of our global data at 30-meter resolution for the different subperils and risk scores and depths, that's around about 1 terabyte of data. But of course, that scales with every climate option you pick. And if you want to look at uncertainty, with every percentile you pick. So it's very easy, very quickly to get into multiple tens of terabytes of data. Again, not necessarily a problem. We have clients that can cope with that level of data, but certainly a consideration. Another way of accessing our data is using third-party platforms, so using our partners. And of course, that can be the quickest way of adopting our data if you're already using a partner system that has our data in it. And I've listed a few of our partners on this slide here. There's more on our website. But what I would say is if you want to access our data through a partner and you don't see our data on that partner's list of data, then do contact us or contact the partner, because it's very often very easy and very quick to get our data into third-party systems. A new option you will have soon is the ability to access all the data you've seen through an API hosted by us. And the great advantage of that is you don't need to host large amounts of data, and you will have access to the full flexibility of climate options. And given that's new for us, we haven't hosted an API before, I thought I'd spend just a minute or two talking about that. Next slide, please. So the API is conceptually very simple. You provide as a user a point or a sequence of points, and that's latitude and longitudes, or you provide an area or sequence of areas. So that's vertices of a polygon or a shapefile or set of shapefiles. You tell us what data layers you want, so whether it's depths or risk scores and what types, and you tell us the climate options you want. And the API returns the values for the requested layers, either as a set of point data if you've asked for points, or a set of GeoTIFF data if you've asked for areas. So very simple conceptually. Obviously, coping with a huge amount of dimensionality and a huge volume of data makes it an interesting technical challenge. But the development's going well. Beta testing is complete. We had a beta testing program that finished about a month ago. We're now working through the findings from that. We plan to bring on early adopters during December with a full rollout in early 2023. So if you're interested in accessing our data through the API, please do contact us. Next slide, please. So when's all of the data you've heard about today, when will this be released? Well, the inland data is imminent. And what I mean by imminent is we'll be shipping it next month. So in the time it takes you to sign a data evaluation agreement with us, the data will be ready. And that's for both fluvial and pluvial flood types, and for current data and for all the future data. You've heard about the climate condition data. We'll finish the coastal data, the coastal modelling, by the end of this year. And again, that's for both the current data and the future climate conditions data. Next slide, please. So I'd like to finish by just going over once more the key advances that Andy spoke about in his part of this webinar. The terrain data is significant. Even if we only had FADDEM, so the new terrain data that we published earlier this year, and LiDAR, that would in and of itself be enough to warrant a brand new release of our flood map data. It's a very significant step forward. And in fact, if you're not interested at all in flood, but you are interested in terrain data, that's a product in its own right that you can license from us. The extension of not just inland flood risk, but to coastal flood risk as well, is new for us, and we think relatively new for the industry in such a sort of commercially available way. Climate dynamics, Nat spoke about, and you'll hear more about that in the webinar in a couple of weeks' time. We think the sheer flexibility that we're offering, including the uncertainty quantification, is genuinely a new thing. Cutting edge methods, quite difficult to get those across in a short webinar, but papers written on those, and we genuinely believe that the incorporation of these methods that were only published a year or two ago, so they really are new science, will make a very big difference to how well we can quantify flood risk. The validation, all published externally. You heard from Andy that all the validation work that is being carried out right now on these maps will be published externally as well. And risk scores, I've spoken to, a new component of this flood map product compared to our previous flood map products. So it's for all these reasons that we think that our new global flood map really is a significant step change in our collective ability to understand flood risk and how flood risk changes in response to climate change. And with that, I'll hand over to Stuart, who will let you know how to find out more information about this product, and I'm sure there'll be time for some questions.
Well, thank you, Matt, and thank you, Doctors Andy and Natalie as well. And thank you also to all of you who've joined us today. We hope you found what we had to say interesting. You'll be receiving shortly after this webinar an email with a link to the recording of this if you want to listen to this again, and also a link to the next webinar in the series. It's been mentioned a few times and also put in the chat. I think that there's a follow-up, more detailed dive into the climate dynamics framework, which will be taking place on the 16th of November. Again, we'll be running that at 2 times to cater for as many timescales as we can. So please have a look at that, follow the link, and there's a registration page both in the chat below but also on our website. Equally, if you'd like more information about what we do here at Fathom, be it global flood maps, catastrophe models, or FabDem, then ping us an email at info@fathom.global or have a look on the website. And please, if you're not already, do follow us on LinkedIn. We post a lot of regular updates, not just to what we're doing in the product space, but also to the pieces of academic research and papers that we regularly publish. Another event I'd just like to highlight, particularly for those of you who are London-based or can be London-based and are in the insurance market, is an in-person event that we're running with our partner RIASC next Tuesday on the 1st of November. The title of that is Tropical Cyclone Managing Tomorrow's Climate Risk Today. We'll be talking about the recently announced partnership we've entered into with RIASC and how we're bringing together the brains and science, both in the worlds of tropical cyclone and flood modelling, to create something which, again, we think is pretty new and innovative in the market. And that will be how we'll be presenting a combined view of both the interrelated perils of flood and tropical cyclones. So that event starts at 4:30 in London next Tuesday and runs till 8. And because flood and climate modelling and tropical cyclone is thirsty work, you'll be happy to hear there's also a free bar that evening. You'll be able to meet the Fathom team, the RIASC team, and also hear from speakers from Securis, Brit, Canopius, and Capgemini. Again, if you're interested in that, please send us an email at info@fathom.global. Okay, let me just have a look at the questions. And if anyone listening has any questions, please just post them in the Q&A tab at the bottom, and I will just collate the questions that we have and start to read them through. The first one we have is your model capable of, number one, representing the interactions of different flood sources, for example, compound flooding, and number two, capturing the spatial dependence of flood peaks, for example, river flows, extreme river flows between different locations. Andy, do you want to take that?
Sure, sounds like one for me.
It does.
Yes, in short, yes, we can do that. We haven't done it globally, because if you're going to do that, then what you end up with is a multivariate probabilistic model. So you have to simulate all kinds of probabilities of flood peaks interacting in different ways. We actually did that in the US. We undertook a pretty extensive multivariate simulation of compound flooding across the US. It actually had, and this was surprising to us actually, is that it actually had a much smaller impact than we thought, in truth. Yes, in some areas it was more significant, but in all it was a less significant phenomenon than I thought. But we can do it. We typically would do that on smaller scales because, again, you have to, it's a multivariate simulation, so we can do it on bespoke projects. But if you did it globally, you'd end up with many iterations of the planet, which is just computationally not possible.
Thanks, Andy. I think probably another one for you here, which is around defended areas. Are we providing the footprint of the defended area and the standard protection at a particular design return period? You're on mute, Andy.
Sorry. Yeah, we can. So we provide defended and undefended views. The defenses, as I said in the talk, are explicitly represented where we know they exist, and where they're not, we model them, and we can provide. I don't think we've done this yet. We've helped the Army Corps of Engineers in the US try to estimate the frequency overtopping of their own defenses, but I don't think we've licensed defense information externally, but could be done.
All right, thank you. We had a question posted earlier. How are your global flood maps different to the other flood data available on the market? I don't think I'll put that one back to answer again. I hope we've answered that pretty substantially throughout, and Matt summarised some of the detailed content from Andy and Nat there. But we genuinely think that there are a whole number of pretty significant differentiators between what Fathom currently offers and what others are offering. So again, we're not going to go into that in detail again here. It's in the recording, it's in the deck, and obviously contact us if you want to delve into any of the specifics there in any more detail. A question here: what's the single most important component of any flood model and why? If you'd like to answer that, Andy. I think
that'll be me again. I think
digital terrain would be my guess, but you may say something different.
No, that's it. Yeah. Flood modeling is an incredibly localized, complex thing to simulate. You have to have things like estimates of boundary conditions, channel conveyance, defense features. But the reality is, when it comes to building a good flood model, the dominant thing by a long way is the terrain data set. And frankly, we've understood the physics of flood models for, it's not even decades, it's centuries. Like the physics of the flow of water we've understood. And unsurprisingly, one of the principal things you have to get right is where is downhill? Water flows downhill. Yeah, terrain is the thing that governs the quality of a model above everything else.
All right, thank you. And I have a specific question here on validation, particularly around the example we gave in Vietnam. The question was that our validation estimate was impressive there with an 84% match. How representative is that given geographic variability, and what's the best and worst we've estimated?
It's a good question. And yeah, if experience is anything to go by, there will be large geographic variation. What we tend to see is that the models do indeed perform a little bit better in wetter environments, in temperate zones as well. There tends to be a greater match. The models tend to be less accurate in arid regions. I think that was indicated in the table I showed with the discharge estimates. So even things like the discharge models they kind of don't perform as well in arid regions for reasons that I won't go into here, but arid hydrology is really difficult. Also things like channels are not very well defined in arid regions. So it's a really good point by whoever has asked the question. Yeah, a huge caveat to that single test case is that I've given a number there of a single test case. On the whole, we're seeing increases in hit rates and larger reductions in false alarm ratios, but more will follow, and I can't post too much of the results right now because it'll be submitted for publication soon. But yeah, there'll be big variation for sure.
Sure. All right, thanks, Andy, and yet more for Andy here. You're earning your breakfast this morning. Speaking of the US, regarding defense structures, does our data include culverts? And if so, what's the minimum size of those included?
So they do include culverts. And the reason that they do is that we actually run something called a subgrid channel network. So the channels themselves are represented off grid. Now, the culverts themselves are just linked to the process where I mentioned our estimate of channel bathymetry based on return period estimate. So for example, if a channel runs through a structure, be it a highway or something else, our model will represent the culvert there because the channel is represented off grid. So it will represent the conveyance of water through that structure. But the size of it can be anything that we want. But what it is it's linked to our estimate of bankful return period. We can go in, and we have done, we can go in and manually edit those things. So we can define the conveyance of specific structures to be whatever we want, just represented by the subgrid channel.
All right, thank you. Another question from anonymous attendee: what are your pricing schemes? I think I'll take that. I mean, our pricing schemes are, as you would expect, fair, entirely fair and reasonable for the value that we believe the data provide. It's actually a slight, obviously that's a trite answer, but there's a lot of complexity around the pricing depending on how the data are to be consumed, the volumes of data and the use to which it's going to be put. So I don't know what lies behind that particular question and the use case the questioner had in mind, but please, contact us independently and we'll talk through what your particular needs might be and what pricing applies there. A question here: what's the computational time for a 12-hour simulation period? I think that's probably another depends, but
yeah, that's a big depends. So it depends on what peril we're talking about. It depends on what's in the domain. So there'll be huge variation depending on where the domain is. And what I mean by that is that we could have a 12-hour simulation of a region of the US, for example, that doesn't contain any big rivers. Or you can have a 12-hour simulation that's a domain that's over the Mississippi. So it depends, it kind of varies in space. If you read some of the papers, we don't simulate, it's not possible to simulate everything all at once. We're not simulating the whole planet at once. It's actually hydraulically, it's broken down into smaller pieces. And those pieces, the simulation times vary hugely depending on what's in them.
All right, thank you. I'm conscious of time. We've reached our 9 o'clock deadline. I know people are busy and have things to do. There are plenty of other questions. I'm sure there's a couple that are coming in at the moment, but please either join us later on for a repeat of this webinar or more practically, just reach out directly to us. Again, thank you to everyone for your time. We hope you found that useful. Thanks to my fellow contributors and panelists, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with you. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.